Thank you all very much.
And he cleans up good, too.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. I know that this has been a wonderful evening, and we're only halfway through. Isn't that cool? One thing I do need to correct Elizabeth on, I loved being the only guy in class. It was wonderful. The stories that I'm going to bring to you now are from Appalachia. There was a woman by the name of Rosemary Wells, and she was fascinated with another woman by the name of Mary Breckinridge. Rosemary researched and wrote some stories, and they're in a book called Mary on Horseback, and I've chosen 2 stories from that book. A little bit about Mary Breckinridge. She was born to wealth, could have lived a very easy and comfortable life, but she lost 2 babies, one at 5 years old and one right after she was born, and she became very much an advocate for health care. This was in the early to mid-1920s. I heard Mama holler. She screamed from the porch, and I came running just in time to see Daddy. The men were carrying Daddy up onto the porch. His leg was great big. I'd never seen it that big, and his face was pale. He was a riverman, and his leg had been crushed between 2 logs on the river. And one of the men looked at me and said, go get the horse doctor, because he's got a bone saw. We're going to have to take his leg off. And I looked at Mama, and Mama said, no, go get Biddy. Well, Biddy was the woman that looked after us in the mountains. She was a mountain medicine woman. And I went and got Biddy. And Biddy came, even though she was over 100 years old, she could still strip the bark off of a willow tree. And she boiled that bark till it was as soft as collard greens, and she wrapped it around Daddy's leg. And then she took an axe and put it up underneath the bed with the blade up. That was to cut the fever. That's all she could do. And Mama looked at me later that night and said, we're going to have to take Daddy's leg off. I said, no, Mama, wait till the doctor gets here, because I know what that means if Daddy can't work. I know that we've only got a handful of dimes in that mason jar. And I know if Daddy can't work, that means we got to go live with Uncle Jip and Aunt Sally. And I know what that means for me. That means I'm 3 to a bed with my little baby cousin and my big old cousin Judah. He takes up 2/3 of the bed himself. And I also know that means we got nothing but leftovers to eat. So I said, Mama, wait till the doctor gets here. Well, it took a whole night and a whole day and a whole night again before I heard that horse coming up Beach Fork, crunching in the gravel by the creek bed. And I said, Mama, the doctor's here. And I went to the window and I looked out. It wasn't a doctor at all. It was a woman on horseback. And she rode up. And she got off the horse and she came up on the porch. And I opened the door. She said, what's your name? I said, my name's Johnny Hawkins. She said, well, nice to meet you. My name's Mary Breckinridge. I'm a nurse. And Mary took her saddlebag in and she started taking her stuff out. She had scissors and stuff. She told Mama, I need your help. We're going to be able to save this leg, but we got to clean it up and splint it. Well, they started working with Daddy's leg and he started hollering. I couldn't stand it. I had to leave. I'll go take care of Mary's horse. So I went out where I felt safe and comfortable with the horses. I could hear Daddy screaming. And when the screaming died down, I came back and I peeked in the cabin window. And I could see Mary, that nurse woman, with a bottle turned up and a needle or something stuck inside of it. And she was drawing some stuff out. And she put it in Daddy's arm. Well, my belly was full of butterflies. I thought I was going to be sick, so I had to leave again. Well, I came back a few minutes later and opened the door, and Ma and Pa were asleep. And Mary was putting her stuff back in her saddlebags. And she pulled 2 sandwiches out, and she gave me one. And I started eating that sandwich. I'd never tasted chicken salad before, and it was good. Well, the next morning, when the voices and the sunlight filled the cabin, and Mary and I had had breakfast, Mary said, how'd your pa get hurt? And I told her that he was a riverman. She said, what does that mean? I said, well, in the wintertime, they cut those trees down, and then they put them in the river, and they float them down. It takes them 2 days, and Daddy rides those logs. He's good at it, too. Till they get in the chutes, that's where the water gets real frothy. Well, that's when Uncle Jip showed up and the other men, and they loaded Daddy back in that stretcher that they'd made with 2 broomsticks and a couple of coats. And they started to take Daddy down to the bottom of the mountain because they were going to take him to a hospital. And I told Mom, I said, I'm going to go with them. Mom said, no, you can't go, Johnny. You got to stay here with us. Well, I waited until the men had gotten Paul out of sight. They were going down that deer trail right next to Beach Fork. And I looked at Aunt Sally and I said, I'm going with them. And I took off out the door. Well, she grabbed for me, but I was way too quick for her. And I followed them down that mountain. Now, in the woods, I can move just like a fox when I need to, so I stayed far enough behind they didn't hear me. Well, that wasn't until my belly got hungry around noontime. And I caught up with them and I showed myself. And Mary looked at me. She said, what are you doing? I said, I've got to come with Paul. So she scooped me up onto her horse. And I thought I was going to get a whooping. But she said, you know, I've got a son as hard-headed. I had a son as hard-headed as you. I said, what happened to your son? She said, well, I reckon now he's sitting in God's lap just like you're sitting in mine. And Mary said, did you write a note and tell your mama where you're going? I said, no, but I told Aunt Sally. Mary said, you can't write, can you? I said, no, ma'am. She said, what do you want to be when you grow up, Johnny? I want to be a riverman just like my pa. I figured she's probably thinking, you want to get your leg crushed too, but that's not what she said. She said, Johnny Hawkins, you can be anything you want, and so can I. Well, I thought, you're a nurse, Mary. I said, you're already what you want to be, aren't you? She said, no. She said, when I came up into these mountains, a lot of poor people up here, but they treated me just like family. You mountain people treated me just like kin. You'd bring me in. And there's so poor up here, and they don't have good medicine. That's what I want to do. I want to bring nurses and doctors up to these mountains. I want to build a hospital. If I've got to lay the brick and mortar myself, Mary said she was going to build herself a hospital up here. Well, by then, we were down to the bottom of the mountain. We went over to that railroad station in Hyden, and we loaded Paul on that train. I didn't know if I'd ever see my Paul again. And I leaned down and kissed him on the cheek to say goodbye. His cheek was hot as a chimney. And they took him off. Well, Mary scooped me back up on her horse, and we went back to her house, the big house there at Wendover. And I stayed there. I'd be out in the morning, I'd hoe that garden, and I'd pick up the eggs. But while I was out there hoeing, I got worried about what would happen if Paul never came home. I'd have to sleep with Judah. Judah haunted my dreams at night. Well, in the afternoons, the nurses would take me into the library. And that one nurse, Nurse Peacock, she taught me how to write my own name. And Nurse Texas, she opened a book and showed me how to start reading. And one afternoon, Mary brought me into her office. And she had a piece of paper, and she started drawing on that piece of paper. She said, 30 feet by 30 feet. I said, what are feet? She says, you don't know what feet and inches are, do you? I said, no, ma'am. That's when she pulled out a ruler and she told me inches. And she told me what a foot was. She gave me that ruler. And she showed me on that paper that those lines represented walls. She said that was going to be the clinic she builds at Beach Fork. 30 feet by 30 feet. And she showed me where the kitchen was going to be. She showed me where the waiting room was going to be. She showed me where the dispensary was going to be. And I took all those lines off of that paper and I put them in my mind. Well, one day, one of the nurses told me, I was sitting there picking up my dinner because I was awful worried. One day, one of the nurses told me that your Paul's going to be able to keep his leg. Oh, I was so relieved. It was that night that Judah left my nightmares. And then that day in August, when Paul came home, we went down to that railroad station there in Hyden, just where we'd seen him last. And he walked off of that train on both legs. Now, Paul couldn't ever really talk to women folk all that well. He took his hat off and was kind of ruffling it in his hands, and he looked at Mary and he said, I'm powerful, thankful for what you've done for me and my family. And Mary said, I understand and you're welcome, but I'll need your help one of these days. And oh, it was a wonderful day when me and Paul went back home up at Beach Fork. And that next morning, that first morning I was back home, I got a bucket of rocks, white rocks. And I went out and I found a nice flat place. I took that ruler that Mary gave me, and I measured out 30 feet by 30 feet. And I took those rocks and I marked where the walls were going to be. And I could see where the kitchen was going to be, and where the waiting room was going to be, and where the examining room was going to be. And if you go up in those mountains today, that's where the Beach Fork Clinic is for the Frontier Nursing Service that Mary Breckenridge built.